This is your final lecture of the semester, and we'll be bringing philosophy all the way into the present day in this lecture. I want to thank you all for your work this semester, and I hope it's been a worthwhile semester for you, and you all enjoy your summer.
Well, if Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie are Hollywood's power company, I hope it won't surprise you to hear that philosophy, 20th century philosophy, has their own power couple. Pictured here, this is Jean-Paul Sartre. You'll hear some Anglicanized pronunciations of his name as Sartre, but more often is Jean-Paul Sartre. And Simone de Beauvoir. They were lifelong lovers, both philosophers, and both were atheists, and so they would, in their philosophy, sort of continue and flesh out the nihilistic tradition that we saw with Nietzsche. However, Sartre will focus much more on individual experience rather than continuing with the Nietzschean category of the overman or superman. Sartre had experiences in World War II that were an enormous influence upon his philosophy, made him very pessimistic about humanity's treatment of the other or the outsider. In the case of war, the allies versus enemies. Again, Sartre represents that tradition that is recognizing that the old liberal thought that humanity is getting better and better and evolving throughout the generations to treat one another more humanely. He is seeing that all fall apart, certainly in the midst of World War II. Now, Sartre did write formal philosophy that was very important for the 20th century. His most well-known full articulation of his existentialism is in a book called Being and Nothingness. It is a very difficult read. But Sartre did not only write formal philosophy in this manner, he also wrote novels and plays to express his existentialism. You may also have heard of his most well-known contemporary, Albert Camus. Camus is also known for writing philosophy in a more creative and artistic genre, again, such as poems, novels, and plays. Sartre, as well as de Beauvoir, viewed philosophy as a holistic vision that guides one's life. And rather than looking at your life as some sort of static reality that you're stuck in or that you've been fated to, Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir both viewed life as a dynamic process, and that our choices, our decisions, are very important in shaping the direction of that process. The scholar and pastor pictured here certainly needs no introduction. This is, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and as the primary face, perhaps along with Malcolm X, for the civil rights movement of the 1960s. What happened with that ensured that philosophy would never again be some discipline that is reserved for the classroom only, for abstract thought only, but shows how philosophy becomes very important for social justice and our ethical thinking. We see that the social justice movement that began in the 60s and continues to this very day is trying to underscore that if we just talk about ideas like justice, equality, humane treatment, if we're not actually trying to embody or enact those kind of virtues, our philosophy is empty. And that's certainly what the civil rights movement sought to demonstrate. Now, philosophical ethics begins to move in the direction of identifying groups that have been oppressed and working toward justice and equality for these groups. If Nietzsche were to see that this is the direction philosophy and ethics would take just 60 years after his death, he would roll over in his grave. This is not society's overman taking advantage of his power, as using his power, his will to power, to continue to gain more and more power, but is instead this vision of intentionally lessening the will to power out of a sense of moral duty toward others. Now, just to look at an example in current events here, regardless of what your feelings are about Ferguson, Missouri, just the fact that that story has such magnitude and is such a heated story in the media and in the news today, shows that the struggle that began in the 1960s does continue today. And not only for the African American community, as that ties in somewhat with the Ferguson story, but also with Hispanics, Latinos pertaining to immigration issues, women pertaining to equal workplace compensation and benefits. To this very day, women only make 70 to 75 cents to the dollar for what a man makes for the very same job. And also one minority group that is certainly gaining in population with the baby boomers coming into their senior citizen years now, that is not talked about as much as some of these others, is our care for the elderly in respect to healthcare decisions. Now, even though Sartre and de Beauvoir and Camus are all what we would call atheist philosophers, I certainly don't want you to think that philosophy for the 20th century only goes in that direction. The woman pictured here is Simone Weil. She lived in the early 20th century, and she died when she was only 34 years old, but had written a great deal of philosophy, a great deal about her faith. She is described as a Christian mystic and felt an intimate connection with whoever God may be. And she was described by Camus, remember Camus is an atheist, described her as the only great spirit of our time. And even though she had such a short life, she's extremely influential in the 20th century, even though her life was so much shorter than certainly Sartre and even Camus. Weil also combined her philosophy with social activism and some causes in and around World War II, with the way soldiers were being treated and care for the poor and care for the hungry. She was very involved in those sort of activities, felt that she must embody the virtues of her philosophy and act out those virtues. Now, since the 1960s, the racial minority philosophers and women philosophers who were ignored in previous generations are finally being read and appreciated. And they're being read and appreciated not just as viable voices of, oh, we guess you can have a place at the table sort of attitude, but the thoughts that minorities and women have on wisdom is considered indispensable and necessary voices to the discussion, that if we only have white men talking about philosophy, wisdom, knowledge, and truth, then we are greatly limiting any access we're going to have to knowledge or truth. Now, Martha Nussbaum, who is also pictured on this slide, she's the bottom picture here, she describes the role of the philosopher as being an attorney or advocate or lawyer for humanity. In her writings, she describes the philosopher as being invested not just in analyzing and trying to understand the human condition, but also having empathy with that condition. And you would think that that would be something that would have been addressed earlier in the semester, and perhaps was addressed by maybe other women philosophers, but at a time when they were not being listened to or not being read. If the philosopher is himself or herself a human being, of course empathy with that condition would be something that you think would be at the top of the list. Now, in accordance with this, we've now had an entirely new philosophical way of doing ethics that's emerged over the past 50 years. We've looked at the Kantian form of doing ethics, where you have rules or laws that you must follow. We call that the deontological form of doing ethics. We've also had utilitarian or teleological ways of doing ethics, and when you look at the consequence, and we would make arguments there that the means can justify the end as long as the end is the moral good. Well, now we have the emergence of what's called virtue ethics. Then rather than looking at laws or consequences, we should try to identify what we cherish as virtues, things like perhaps generosity, justice, kindness, and that we should try to foster a society in which we embody these virtues. And if these virtues are embodied according to virtue ethicists, we will arrive at what is considered the moral good. And here's your last slide for the entire semester. I'm hoping that after taking this class that you will be interested in living more philosophically aware lives, seeing that philosophy isn't just in a textbook, which maybe that's what you thought it was before this class, but that philosophy is in fact everywhere around us. It's in our movies, our music, our television shows, our churches if we go to church, our hunt clubs if we're hunters, our dinner tables. It's in our everything. And so what I'll leave you with here, as many of you will recognize the picture here, we have the stars of two very popular book and now movie series, the Divergent series and the Hunger Games. And I'll tell you why I've been so fascinated by this literature, by these movies, is that I've noticed that the millennial generation, the generation that is certainly younger than me, I'm about to turn 40 years old in February, so I'm what's considered Generation X, coming of age in the early to mid-90s. But the millennial generation, they have really latched on to these movies that display a dystopian future vision for the world. If you may know the word dystopia, it's the opposite of utopia. Utopia of building the perfect society, and dystopia looks to the future as society falling apart. Now, I want you to give some thought to, if you've seen or read any of this literature, or seen the movies, how much they have in common in the storyline. A young woman is forced into a particular social caste or standing that is not the dominant or the most powerful. She is oppressed by an overbearing government or corporation. Then she rebels as a revolutionary to overthrow her oppressor. And again, very intrigued how the millennial generation has really latched on to this storyline. And I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts on how this relates to the financial disaster, the bubble that burst in 2008 and continues to affect young people, continues to affect millennials today who are graduating from school with debt and searching for well-paying jobs that are few and far between? Now, it's no requirement that you email me any sort of answer to that question, but if you have any interest in a further discussion of that, I'll certainly be willing to do that. I will, however, give you one last little pop culture bonus question that you can email me the answer to for 10 bonus points on your 9th and final reading quiz. As I said earlier, I'm a Generation X guy, and music was very formative when I was coming of age, and I could not stand what we called the hair bands of the 1980s, these rock and roll groups that it was just frivolous lyrics and had big poofy hair and wore these tightly guitars. I couldn't stand the music, and really couldn't stand the bands. And then all of a sudden in the early 90s came a turn with what was initially called alternative rock groups, and I was really drawn to these groups. And the first really big group was called Nirvana, and their song "Smells Like Teen Spirit" is one that tried to bring about much more philosophical depth and existential questions, really, back into music that had been lost in the 80s. I think it had been there a lot in the 60s and into the 70s, but with all the materialism of the American culture that came about in the 80s, the music went that route too. So the 90s was refreshing to have some existential depth returned. And now the question part. Sadly, Nirvana lost their lead singer to either a drug overdose or it was a drug overdose. It's unknown whether it was suicide or unintentional. But sadly, I think the world lost him far too early. If you can email me his name, I will give you 10 points on quiz number 9. And thank you all for your work this semester.